why we changed our approach at all. So you'll be familiar with the fact that we just over a year ago now, we launched our strategy after probably about almost a year's worth of consultation. 4 key themes of that strategy. People and communities was all about how we use the voice of people who use services in our work. We've seen a massive increase in give feedback on care, thanks to many of the partnerships and the colleagues who are on the call today. Almost a trebling of give feedback on care in the last year and a half. It's important we can use that information to guide our assessment activity, to guide our thinking around where and how we inspect. We want to make sure that people feel involved in that work, and part of that is, of course, how we present that information back to the public as we complete our assessment cycles. Smarter regulation is probably the other end of that, is how do we build better data and information, both for providers and for people who use services, around where they sit relative to others. We want to move away from as colleagues from a provider organisation may be familiar, a very large Excel spreadsheet that lands in somebody's email, has to be filled in and returned back. More of an ongoing conversation where much of the information actually comes directly from third parties, although some of it will still come from providers. But crucially, it will provide some more information about where providers sit relative to each other. The third area is safety through learning. We know from our work that sometimes there is a tendency for organisations to be worried about the outcome of an inspection activity, and I think what that doesn't do necessarily is to promote learning through things that don't go well, some things that don't work. So how do we provide more support for organisations to learn from issues around safety, so that they don't repeat the same issues over and over again? And then for many organisations, how we drive that change and improvement, and that's key to me to why we exist as an organisation. We don't exist just to measure organisational performance. We exist to try and drive an improvement in it. We ever since we first published a series called Driving Improvement, which was looking at organisations that were inadequate or requires improvement and move to good and outstanding. We wanted to make sure that we could really understand and try to draw some supportive information around how organisations move from requires improvement or inadequate to good or outstanding, and that accelerating improvement with the right partnerships in the right sector is a key part of our strategy. So at the heart of that new approach is what's called a single assessment framework. So we used to have assessment frameworks designed for different sectors. Over time we've concertinaed them into 2. This is trying to bring a single focus to our assessment of organisations, partly to help us make sure that we're being consistent in the way we judge organisations, but also, frankly, to give ourselves a common view as we begin to look across systems as well as individual providers. So some of the things that will stay the same. First of all, the single assessment framework will apply to all services that we regulate. We will still have the 5 key questions: are services safe, caring, effective, responsive and well led? There will be quality statements that will be I or we statements that sit beneath them. So what do we expect, or what can people who use services expect? And then there'll be some information that sits below that, which is designed to support how an organisation might assess itself against those quality statements. The we statements will indicate what a provider or a commissioner or a system needs to do to deliver high quality care. The I statements will be designed to say what a person who uses service expect from an individual provider. So that new assessment lies at the heart of how we might change what that looks like when we present information to the public and indeed back to providers. So while we're updating our reports, well, one of the first things about our reports that if you're a student of our work over a period of time, our reports are incredibly long and not necessarily accessible. They're usually, well, they're always PDFs, which have its own issues with accessibility. They often are long in terms of how they're put together. they don't always necessarily provide up-to-date information about how services are operating. And these are some of the things that we want to change with our more regular assessment that we intend to do. We also want them to be designed to show how a service is improving or could improve. And obviously we need it to effectively represent the information that we've gathered about an organisation, and indeed to provide that information more in real time. So traditionally we've produced a report after an active inspection. The idea of the always-on view of quality is that we might update our view, our assessment of an organisation on a more regular basis, sometimes by crossing a threshold, sometimes by working with a provider in a different way to gather information and make a judgment about how an organisation is changing. So the new elements of the future report. So the summary of people's experience of a service is vital and lies at the heart of this. Now, we have done this to a degree in the past, but we want to try to make sure that people's experience of a service lies at the heart of how we describe the assessment of our judgment about an organisation. There will be scoring for each of the quality statements based upon the information that we hold and based upon the assessments that we might do as we cross the threshold into to look at how services are operating. And we want to allow those scores so people can see relative movement. The 4 key ratings, inadequate, requires improvement, good, and outstanding, are themselves quite wide, and we want to try and give more information about where an organisation sits in particular areas. And we want to be able to give a better navigation to the reports. As I say, they're currently a PDF document, can be 20 or 30 pages long. We want to try and give better navigation so people can hone in on the issues that they are concerned about, and don't have to sort of wade through a narrative document that might be 20 or 30 pages long to make that judgment. So let's look at the overview page and where we are today. So the overview page today, we've made some changes to our website recently, so the overview page is a bit clearer, but essentially it gives you can see the navigation down the left, and then an overview of safe, caring, effective, responsive, and well led, with an overall rating of an organisation. That's been the same for 5 or 6 years now, where we've had a similar approach to how we view organisational. So it shows a current rating. It obviously gives the names of the people responsible for the service. It clearly states the service that's been offered, and it links to more detailed information that the rating sort of can unpick. So that's our current look and current view. The new elements are that we're testing out, and I think a mock-up was available in the pre-reading. The one thing I say about the mock-up is it is one of the examples of the models that we are testing in our ongoing sort of work with people who services in particular. So don't see the mock-up as a prelude to being the answer. In a sense, it's as much to generate a good debate in this conversation and elsewhere. So it isn't by any means a done deal. In fact, I've got some feedback from the public groups that we've done some testing with. But what we try to do is to give key information about when the organisation was last assessed, when we last published a report, when we last reviewed the ratings of the service, which may not be the same time as when we crossed the threshold, but may be linked to other data and information or other conversations that we'd have with the organisation. So there's a graphical element which shows the rating scale, where the service sits within those ratings. There's a score for a service and the bands for its rating. There's a proportion of services that are similar to that organisation and where similar organisations are rated, and an overall summary and people's experience, gives a sort of a representation of it. Some of this, just to give you a sense of where the public feedback on this is from the work we've been doing with members of the public. So people quite like some of the graphics on the page, the traffic light system and colours and interpreting them. And they thought that the use of graphics was good to help determine the standard of care, but they weren't as familiar with the numerical scores, what they meant. So they relied upon the colours more than the numbers. And there was a limited number of people that sort of linked down into, well, what that means. What is a score of, in this case, 56? What does that mean for how services are operate? People noticed the information about the direction of change and improvement, and they did use that to make informed. They said they would use that to make informed decisions. So it isn't for me just about what we see at the time of a particular assessment, but how the organisation is changing in response to that service. Which is why, for me, the active assessment doesn't just end necessarily with our view. It might end with what the provider is then doing about our view. And people are keen to understand that. They're also keen to understand the history of an organisation, and it varies from just wanting to understand the previous report to almost the entire lifespan of a service. And I know that's challenging for colleagues who where you may take over an organisation that was a failing and improve it, but there's a real sense of people trying to understand the organisational history gives them confidence about where the organisation is going. So people said that there's lots of information to engage with, and they were keen to click through for more information in particular areas, and particularly under each of the quality statements that are relative, that are important to them. Also, the services that are relatively important to them. So we were talking to women that were going to have going to use maternity services. That's where they would go for their information. They'd move away from the overall information and look at the services that are particularly relevant for them. So that's some of the early feedback we've had on this, and why, as I say, I don't want people to give the impression that is an absolute done deal. It absolutely isn't, and we want to use this conversation and the work we've been doing with the public directly to try and build a better view of what that might look like moving forward. Just go into the summary. So the current summary page, so again, just for your information, you'll see the latest inspection report, the overall, the key questions. You may see some information on population groups and core services. Where the latest inspection was not a comprehensive one, it means that the page is an aggregate from different inspections on different dates. So if we did a focused inspection where we produced a rating in one of the key areas, that may appear alongside a comprehensive inspection which was at a different date. So that's how we currently describe a service performing on our website. Some of the things the new elements that we want to change, obviously going back to that summary of people's experience of the service, as well as an overall summary of what we think about that service. The same ratings position, that sort of graphic for each of the key questions, standard statements for each of the key questions, and a link to a full HTML report, which is essentially a more searchable version of the current PDF report. So what that would look like is something like this. And again, this is very much an example that we are currently testing, and not something you should take up. That will be exactly how it looks when we do that work, when we produce this as a final draft. So you can see here safe, and some of where the organisation with regards to safe, what our assessment is, what the scores are that underpin that assessment of safe. And again, the same issues. People like the graphic representation. They're less engaged with the number. So we've got to think about how do we present that? And in fact, do we present it in the same way for providers and people who use services? We may not. We may present it differently for those different audiences. That's an example of what that would look like. So in terms of the all reports and timelines, so now there is a history of all reports that we published about a service. If you go on, the dates and descriptions of the relevant, so was it about direct monitoring, was it a full inspection? In the future, we want to keep that timeline linked to the full reports on the web pages, right back to registration dates and the date that the organisation was added. So this would be more of a comprehensive perspective on our view of that organisation. So we're not trying to make any massive changes here, but we are trying to make sure that we link registration, changes, enforcement action, what we know about an organisation, what they know about themselves, and how they are responding to our assessment activity. But that will be a feature on a sort of a timeline that people be able to track back. Not everybody will track back, but we know there's a group of people who are particularly keen to look back over the history of an organisation, so we want to make sure that is available. And then the full HTML report. So now we publish a long PDF reports that are not very accessible, can't search them. They take time for us to write, but also they take a lot of time for people to read. And we know from our with some testing that we've already done that the HTML report is not necessarily viewed as something that people will engage with well. In the future, we want to provide a more up-to-date view of quality tailored to different audiences so they can use and understand them. The information will be presented hopefully in a clearer way with more detailed benchmarking information to help the provider improve and also to give a sense of where the organisation is. And for me particularly, I want to make sure that the provider's voice in terms of what they are doing about where they are is critical. You can also see in the future a link between where an individual provider is and indeed where the local system is. And part of the conversation is how do we draw those links between provider and local system in that conversation as well.
Talked a bit about benchmarking. So liked the idea of benchmarking, and there was a question about whether we could see people would be able to see in a local area and kind of across practices. And then there was also people generally liked graphics as well, and we might have strayed a bit into where beyond inspection reports and more into kind of the provider portal, or the kind of the way people might be able to see and access information, but talked about generally graphics are easier to kind of digest and see, but if people could be able to extract them, so thinking providers in particular when they're reporting to board, for example, if they can either create their own kind of reports or graphics that they can then export and use to present back, that's a feature that would be really helpful. And then kind of a bit of a conversation about generally when people are looking at services, they're often at a kind of a crisis point where they need to know what the current the rating is or the quality of that service. So there was a question about the timescales and I suppose how current the information would be, and also a point that sometimes people's needs change through assessment. So it might be that they're looking for a particular service, but then while they're being assessed, their health deteriorates and they need something slightly different. So again, just thinking about that, I suppose the immediacy of the information, and kind of being clear on when the information was last updated. And then finally, and I'll see if you've got anything to add, Chris, but we also talked a little bit about whether there could be almost a different view for the public and providers. So thinking about the different needs that they have from our reports, having kind of that high level, really quick, easy summary to give an idea of the picture of the quality, and then something that's slightly different for providers where they can go into that detail. It might be that moving to HTML anyway allows for that, but just I suppose the point that people have different needs from the reports, and how do we best accommodate for what people need. I'll stop there.
I think that's fairly comprehensive. I think it's a great conversation about what makes up the score and how, which I think is in the chat as well, what makes up the score and how do we determine the score for a particular area, which we can talk to as well coming forward.
Talked about the visuals and how the visuals are very helpful, but they could be a bit more helpful. For example, they could tell a bit of a story. For example, where a service sits on the rating scale in the geographical area. So if people are comparing services in the local area, you know, they can see that easily on the visual. Also, explaining the numbers a bit more as well. There's some confusion about what does 56 mean? Is it a percentage? Is it out of a certain number? Maybe using the, for example, if there's 80% are good, maybe having the bar 80% big for good and then smaller for the other ratings, just to kind of give a clear picture of what that means. And maybe perhaps having a video format of the report as well to make it more accessible. We also talked about the CQC needing to do more to let people know that a report has been published, because people always are on the lookout for it, but they don't always get an alert for people to, and now that it's now there. And also, the report needs to let people know what change is required to improve a rating. So we're giving a rating for all these areas, but we need to make it clear to providers and to the public, you know, what that service needs to do to improve that rating. And finally, also, we talked a lot about equality, diversity and inclusion and what the report needs to do to be able to help promote these. That was seen as a very important aspect as well.
Yeah, absolutely. We had a really good discussion. Certainly there was agreement with some of the points that have been raised already about there needing to be greater context to the comparator if we're going to do that, not just in terms of geography, but also more subtly, perhaps in terms of service type. Not to be so, you know, not to have blunt measure, not you know, one care home is not necessarily the same as another care home. So some thoughts about the comparison there. There was a tentative welcome to the principle of showing the scoring in terms of how close you are to one rating, but we had that discussion that other groups have just fed back about, well, what does that tell you though about what a service needs to do to improve? If you're trying to learn from other services, then what's the detail there? On the basis of the information that was presented today, which isn't everything that we've got in our back pocket and, you know, we'll be sharing in due course, I think people found the graphics themselves, you know, there were some less sharp images, which perhaps didn't help people's understanding, but there's also the fact that if you were just looking at it, you might need some additional labelling. People have talked, haven't they, already about what's that? That's not clear. So unless we add labelling or some other description, it might not be immediately obvious. I think the other point was just about the principle of a shorter report, and whilst there were some benefits to that, there's obviously some drawbacks in what you might lose in terms of the detail. We'd only really just gotten to sort of discuss about that, but I think that's important because, excuse me, I don't know why I've got a frog in my throat now. We talked about people's experience, and there was some discussion in the group about making sure that's balanced, and that of course people's experience is important, we should be reporting on that, but that's not all we should do. So I think just on the basis of what we shared today, I guess it left people with some questions about how the detail is going to be mapped out, and, you know, how does this relate to quality statements, and will there be scoring on quality statements, and what will be published? So I guess people need a bit more time in these discussions, so it's really good to hear that there will be some more time. So I think those are the things to share from my group, but I haven't missed anything out major. Group 6, thank you very much.
Much of the similar kind of points made, really. Accessibility was considered to be a really important kind of point, and I guess that links partly into some of the infographics that they felt would be really helpful in sort of understanding more around sort of what the information and what the ratings kind of meant. Linking to that is around really getting an understanding of what the ratings or what we're saying means to people who are using the service. So you know, maybe tying it in more to things like the I statements, you know, that we've got, but at all levels it's about, well, what does that kind of, what does that mean to what somebody is experiencing the service? And I'm talking about sort of quite a high level. So obviously there will be narrative that explains that, but this is about how we represent the ratings or the quality statements in that way. I think the other thing was around the summary page, was around having a bit more granularity, and I think some people have touched on it. So part of the point about, you know, what does 56 mean, and what is the gap between 56 and the next rating, and how do we make that a bit clearer? But also there was a sense about having, as I said, sort of more information available on that overview page. but in a, obviously it's difficult with a static picture, but what you can do on on obviously a web page, so much more around hover over things. So when you hover over the number, for example, you could have something that pops up that shows you actually what was the rating in each of the key questions that there were. Similarly, linking back to the I statements was, when you hover over inadequate, even if the service isn't inadequate, when you hover over each of those ratings, a pop-up which says, what does that mean for somebody, who uses the service? So, for example, inadequate, it might say, I am not getting the care that I need. The service, the service is at risk, of harm or kind of whatever it may be, but sort of something that's using those hover over boxes. I think that was, the only other final point really was just around some concerns around standardized wording, and there was absolute recognition that an understanding about where we are, in terms of how that would make life easier for us, and particularly from a quality assurance point of view, but also that it doesn't become a tick box exercise. And we were starting to get into the conversation about, just because we report something in a certain way doesn't necessarily mean that it would need to be a tick box exercise on site. It is just about what we report of what we on site, and the need to have trust and confidence that we have covered everything in depth, but what we're reporting on might be at a higher level. I think that's probably it from me.
So I think there are potentially three. I'm going to try to group this into sort of three areas that we will definitely look to take forward. If you have missed anything significant, then colleagues, please let me know. So the first sort of I've sort of titled "What does it look like?" And I think here the link between the I and we statements and the scores, and how the scores are made up and what they mean, and being transparent about how we determine a score from the collection of information that sits below an I or we statement is really important. And I think also we've talked a little bit about the graphics and what that looks like, and how that might reflect both an organisational performance. There's also a bit about where services sit relative to others. We talked about in our group the principle of you might link to your ICS or local authority footprint, and also to organisations like you that are in different areas but potentially have some similar socioeconomic drivers. Standard wording for me, I talked about this in our group as well. The benefit of standard wording is actually for colleagues writing reports. So the example I gave is that with the technology that we should be able to see how colleagues who've written similar reports with similar information, what they've said. So I think it's a useful guide for an assessor or an inspector to say, when we see information like this, it tends to be what we say about an organisation, as a guide for an inspector, but not to try to just use standard words in themselves. I think it should always reflect that's my opinion anyway, that it should always reflect the assessor or inspector information. In that way we can deal with things better, like equality, diversity, inclusion, and also like the links to wider system issues. I think you can do that more clearly when you're able to make more of a personal statement. So that's in what it looks like pile. And there's a sort of group which is, do we all have the same view, which is, should the information be presented in slightly different ways for the people who use services and providers? Fundamentally, it's the same information, but do you some of the early feedback from people is the ability to drill down is important, but actually clear statements with clear graphics about what the service is doing is probably important for a provider. Can they extract information and produce their own reports with the data information that we provide? And how might that update be updated even between the active assessments, so that there's information that we can provide that more of an always-on view of quality that supports both benchmarking activity and just generally understanding how services are performing. So that was in do we all have the same view? And the last bit was about reports and what happens next. I really like the idea of a video report, and inspectors may or may not like that. The alerts reports are really interesting. We've done some work recently about how we alert people and how we get people to sign up for reports. And really, really important for me is critically is what are we expecting a provider to do in relation to an assessment that we've made? And I think that point about what happens next and what we're expecting to see next, and coming back to that when next we assess and update an organisation is critical. So those are 3 areas that I've talked about. Just to answer Dawn's question, I think that the ICS reports will be similar to the way we describe providers, but obviously looking at it from a system perspective.